Welcome to Hope for Anxiety and OCD, Episode 5. On today's episode, you are going to get to hear my interview with Rhett Smith. It was an amazing privilege to be able to interview him. He is a former pastor, licensed marriage and family therapist, ministry leader, speaker, podcaster, and also author of the book, The Anxious Christian: Can God Use Your Anxiety for Good? Rhett has some really great things to share with us about the use of a famous verse for anxiety, Philippians 4:6, regarding how sometimes we use this verse well and sometimes we don't. So diving in today, here is my interview with Rhett Smith. Okay, so for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I am in private practice in Plano, Texas, which is kind of a suburb of Dallas. I've been in private practice for probably about, 10 to 12 years, and primarily work with couples and families. I mean, I do a lot of individual work too, but I'm trained and licensed as a marriage and family therapist. And so I spend about half of my week, about 2 days a week, seeing people in my office. And then over the last probably year and a half, I got more into executive coaching and went back to school at SMU to do some more training in that. And I'm currently working with some vice presidents and stuff of some different organizations here in the Dallas area, just kind of doing some executive coaching and helping them, I would say, just perform at a higher level. And then on the side, when I have time, I enjoy to do stuff like this, like podcasting, and do a little bit of writing and a little bit of speaking. But I would say those activities is primarily what takes up my time. And I'm married to my wife, Heather, and I have a 13-year-old daughter who starts 8th grade tomorrow.
Wow.
And a 10-year-old son who starts 4th grade tomorrow online. So that's a little bit about who I am. Yes, it's going to be very different. We're, trying to be flexible and anticipate whatever happens.
I also saw on your website that you're a runner.
I do like to run. I started getting I've always run my entire life, just a little bit here and there, and was in track in high school, but short distance. And the short story is that my brother in 2006 said, "Hey, you want to run a marathon for this organization to raise money?" And I said, "Okay." And so I ran my first marathon in 2006. Prior to that, I'd run no more than maybe 3 miles a time. And
wow.
I started getting into running, and the distances got longer. And I did a 50K, and then I did a 50 miler. And then in February, I just completed my first 100K, which is about 62 miles. And these are all now primarily trail. And I do it mainly, I think, because it's a way for me to kind of have my own therapy and to get out and to have some solitude and silence. And as a way to, as you know, it's a way just to take care of myself and exercise, since I sit in a chair a lot during the week. And so for me, it's just a huge outlet, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I can definitely attest that exercise helps with mental health.
It for sure does.
Yeah. Okay. So you had talked about doing some executive coaching. Do you have a background in business then too? Were you involved in business before therapy, or?
No, before therapy, I was a pastor full time.
Okay.
I had gone to seminary out of college. I was originally, I had actually planned to do this in college. I wanted to be a psychologist, and I took a church history class my senior year, and it changed my life. And so I decided to go to seminary, and I went to Fuller Theological Seminary there in California. I started off at the Extension campus in Arizona, and I was working at my alma mater, which was, at the time, was a small Southern Baptist school called Grand Canyon University. Now it's kind of big online presence. And I was working there and going to school, and then I moved to California and was doing my MDiv, and I was required to do a church internship as a part of that. And as a part of that, I landed at a church called Bel Air Presbyterian Church, and I was working in the college ministry on the campuses of USC and UCLA. And just by a weird kind of circumstances, They ended up putting my name in the hat, if you will. They're on the search for a new college pastor, and I didn't really want to be in ministry. Really, I just went to seminary to do like a PhD. I wanted to teach, and I ended up getting the job. And I was the college pastor there in Los Angeles for about 7 to 8 years. And so I have no business background, but it was in the ministry. And the way that I got into therapy was just working with college students day in and day out. What I realized, what I love was not the preaching and the speaking, but was the one-on-one and helping people through difficult times. And I just felt ill-equipped to handle some of the more difficult situations. So I decided to go back to Fuller Seminary when I was pastoring and did my marriage and family therapy program there. And I think the combined experience of working with pastors and leaders and doing therapy, it just helped in such a way that all of a sudden I had business leaders and organizations ask me to come speak and to talk to their leaders about, mental health or how to deal with difficult relationships or what our boundaries are like in the workplace. And so I found myself in the business world, with no really quote unquote business experience except building my own practice. And I just decided I really enjoyed that aspect of work too. Working with business leaders to help them figure out how to perform at higher levels and how to actually kind of take care of themselves. And to be honest, even though it's not therapy, most of them are like, hey, I don't mind if you do a little therapy. Awesome. So I'm in this weird place, kind of spending time between church world, kind of corporate world, and in my own private practice, and just kind of learning a lot along the way.
What's really interesting, though, I would imagine, is that there's a lot of overlap and relationship principles. You can apply those anywhere. You can apply those in your marriage. You can apply them at work. You can apply them in your corporation. So there's probably a lot of overlap in that wisdom.
Yeah, I would think in my experience, I'm sure from yours, like any of the training that we've done, especially when relationships and family systems and stuff, is that it's real easy to apply to organizational systems. And I may have to change the language a little bit in terms of how we communicate and the tools that I might use. But what I've come to learn recently is that there's really nothing new under the sun. Everyone's kind of saying the same thing. It's just we're all coming from it from different angles. And so I've enjoyed, stepping into that world, and I feel kind of green and new at it, but I've learned a lot.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about the trainings that you're doing with pastors on mental health issues?
Yeah. One of my mentors is Terry Hargrave. He's at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he founded a model called restoration therapy. And I kind of got into that by doing some marriage intensives back in 2010 through 2014 up at a ranch here in Texas. We would bring couples in and do these marriage intensives. And that model we used was his model, which eventually he kind of built into a bigger framework and started training therapists. And I was trained early on in his model, and he's been really close to him. And over the course of the last several years, him and his wife, Sharon's on staff at the Boone Center for Marriage and Family at Pepperdine University. They got together with some other leaders at like Azusa Pacific, at Fuller Seminary. And they decided that, we need to equip and train pastors. Pastors are overwhelmed and busy, and they're dealing with all kinds of issues, and they're the front line really that people bring all kinds of issues to. And so they put together a team of about, let's say 7 to 9 people with experience in different issues related to mental health. And they kind of tagged me to talk about anxiety and depression. So for the last few years, about approximately 2 to 3 times a year, we show up at Pepperdine, and about 50 to 60 ministry leaders and their spouses will come, and we'll just train them for 2 or 3 days on these different topics and help equip them and help kind of organize them how to maybe handle specific issues and also how to refer out specific issues. And so I've had a real passion for that, and I enjoy doing that. And we've recently had some of our work published through Barna as part of a relationship kind of mental health piece. And so I'll be doing that again in a few weeks, and I'm looking forward to that.
That's awesome. I think pastors oftentimes are ill-equipped to deal with mental health issues. And so providing that training is is really crucial because they are on the front lines and people are coming to them with problems.
Yeah, it's a lot to ask a pastor too, who at the most maybe was required or given one class on like counseling and seminary, and then everyone comes to them for everything really. And so there's this huge gap, I think. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to come alongside pastors and to kind of be a resource for them and help them in any way that we can. And that's something that I really, being a former pastor myself, I feel like that's really important.
Do you find that some are hesitant to refer out because they aren't sure if people are going to be getting like sound biblical advice or feedback on their issues?
Yes, for sure. And you talked about going to Denver Seminary, and I went to Fuller Seminary, and a lot of my friends here go to Dallas Seminary. And so depending on the education, pastors are concerned about what kind of therapy is it going to be? Is it going to be biblical therapy? Is it going to be some type of new what's the word? Nouthetic, which is or like nouthetic, which is basically the only counseling we provide is you open the Bible and point to specific verses, or it might be like New Age, and so I guess what I tell pastors is, my job as a therapist is to bring the best psychological tools that they are and to integrate my faith into that process. That's how I was trained. And so what I find is if I have a good relationship with the pastor, then they feel, safe and trustworthy. And then I also will create a list of different therapists in the area that I think are really great at what they do, and we'll give those to pastors as well. But I think that is a huge fear for pastors, and I understand that. But I think it's changed over the years. I don't see that fear nearly as much as I used to.
That's good.
And I think churches have done a good job of vetting who they think is best for their congregation. And so I always tell people, if you're looking for a therapist you don't know, the best place to go maybe is just go to your church. They usually have a list of therapists that they highly recommend.
So you wrote a book about anxiety called The Anxious Christian, which I wanted us to dive into a little bit. But I also before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about this verse, Philippians 4:6, for a moment. Be anxious for nothing. And there are a lot of Christians struggling with anxiety, and they tell me that, I feel shame around this verse because I've tried so hard not to be anxious through prayer. I've tried to bring everything to God. I've tried to ask him to take this anxiety away. Are there times you feel like where we as Christians misapply this verse or take it out of context?
Yes. And I think that's the verse that got me really interested in writing more about this topic. Because like you had people coming to my office and feeling like they needed help. They had reached out to someone, maybe a ministry leader or a friend. And that verse was I think it was meant in good intention, but it was received in a way that made them feel ashamed, like you said, or like their faith wasn't good enough. And so they ended up in a counseling office with someone they didn't know. That was only safe place. And I felt, in some ways, I feel that's a tragedy that, they had to go somewhere where they didn't even know anyone to talk through this. And I do think it's misapplied, and we can talk about this at length, but in short, the flow of that whole book, there's a lot going on. The word there in 4:6 that Paul uses for anxiety, where he says, do not be anxious, is the same word he uses for anxiety in Philippians 2:20 when he talks about the anxiety that his ministry leader, I can never say his name right, Epaphroditus, I always say it wrong. He says Epaphroditus has anxiety for the people there, because he cares about them. And Paul uses that same word. And then in 2:28, Paul talks about how he's talking about basically the lessening of his own anxiety. He uses a different word there. They use the word for depression there also in Philippians 2. And so you get this really interesting passage where, Epaphroditus has anxiety. Paul talks about the lessening of his anxiety. You get to Philippians 2 and that beautiful Christ hymn about Christ coming down and suffering on our behalf. And, Paul's someone who's been through a lot of difficult times. And I think in the flow of everything he says, don't be anxious, but if you are, right, in Philippians 4:7-8, he says, do these things. So I just think in the context, they actually acknowledge that there's anxiety present in their lives. but that we can go to God and we can not be anxious. But if we are, here are some things that we can do. And so I just think the whole flow has to be, I think, applied when we talk to people about it rather than just say, don't be anxious. I think that does a disservice to people.
Yeah, I love the other verses in that section that talk about the Lord is near. And you think about like your kids when they were little, like just you being there sometimes is that calming presence for them. So it's like, I'm here, I'm with you, you don't need to be afraid. Like,
yeah. And in 4:7-8, he basically talks about what are beautiful and holy and lovely, these things. He says, meditate on these things. And Paul, he knows thousands of years before we have the science to know it, that the things that we think about change our beliefs, right? The things that we start to believe change our actions. And so I think Paul has a lot of grace for people, and the whole flow of the text needs to be taken into consideration. And we need to handle people, I think, in a very loving way who come to us with anxiety or depression or some other mental health issue.
So you make this argument in your book that, a lot of Christians, I think, are focused on, okay, God, please just take this away. Please, can I get rid of it? Please, I don't want to deal with anxiety anymore. Just release me from it. And you make the point that God can use your anxiety for good. How have you seen that played out in your own life? Or can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. I think I first thought about that idea because I grew up in a family where my mom had breast cancer when I was 6, and she passed away when I was 11. And I talk about my book. That was the day that I began to stutter, and I still stutter sometimes. It's pretty rare. But that was the day also that I said, actually it happened before, but anxiety was kind of introduced into my life. And what I noticed over time was that the really beautiful things that happened in my life were the things that I was forced to work through my anxiety. Anxiety propelled me to work towards those things. And like a couple of examples I use in the book is, when I was a junior in college, I was asked to speak at our chapel for Easter morning sunrise service. And I'd been praying about that God would give me an opportunity to speak somewhere, just because I knew I needed to face my fears. And I got a call to speak, and I declined it. And I remember getting off the phone saying I had prayed about that. So I called them back up and said, I'll do it. And I remember getting up, this is in 1996, almost 10 years after she had passed away, and getting up and speaking in front of an audience really for one of the first times. And I stuttered my way through it. But I knew like something was about to change for me. And this happened later on when I took the job at Bel Air. I remember saying to God, okay, I'll take this job, but you have to show up for me and you have to speak for me. And what I started to notice is that the things in my life that were really important, God somehow used that anxiety to propel me towards things, because the anxiety was uncomfortable. So it forced me to look for solutions. It forced me to look for ways to change and ways to grow. Anxiety doesn't leave you feeling comfortable, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it's like almost like the anxiety was God's way of saying, get up and get moving. I'm not going to let you sit here. I'm not going to let you just struggle in this. And so I just started to listen to my anxiety and pay attention to it. And so if I'm working with people right now, I have them imagine like anxiety is like a conversation partner. Like, what is anxiety saying to you? How can you grow? I'll use the metaphor how, we all drive cars, and our car has dash lights that tell us what's going on underneath the hood. If we pay attention to those things, our car will run smooth and we'll get to our destination. If we ignore those flashing lights, we'll end up stranded, right? Or broken down. And we just know physically and physiology and from the science that depression and anxiety are often just internal cues of like something going on saying, hey, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And so I just encourage people that when they're anxious or feeling depressed, that how can we like listen to those things? Because they might be a way of God guiding us and leading us, and to not see it as something's wrong with you, but maybe there's an opportunity for growth in here. And so I know there's lots of nuance around that. I'm not saying God just gives us anxiety, to grow us, but how do we reframe it as something something wrong with us, and more as maybe an opportunity to come alongside and to move in the direction God is guiding us?
Right. I think for me, I resonate with the sense of sometimes God calls you to do big things. And I think it's normal to be anxious in that process. And for me, it's caused me to lean more on God and rely on Him during that time. But it's also almost been, in some ways, confirmation. Like, oh, okay, I know I need to do this. I feel a spiritual peace that this is where God is leading me. I'm anxious about it because it's bigger than me. It's not something that I can do on my own. Like, I need God to intervene.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's lots of good stories in the Bible where they may not use the word anxiety specifically in the text, but somebody is overwhelmed with the task that God has given them, Moses or Gideon or Peter, Paul, whoever, name them, right? Mary, all of the people that they have to depend on God to get them through that situation. So I love that idea that it's almost confirmation that if it's too big, maybe you were on track.
Right. How do you think that pastors can really support Christians in their congregation who are struggling with some of these issues? Like, how can they come alongside of them and say, I'm here for you?
It's a great question. I think it starts from the top down, right? So if it's a ministry, it's a pastor or a ministry leader or someone who leads like a Bible study within the church or as a volunteer leader. So I think the message actually kind of has to come top down and the message I think needs to be something like, we want you to know that it's okay if you struggle with mental health issues, anxiety, depression. Well, it's okay. There's not a stigma around it. I think that almost has to be verbally spoken. And then 2, we are going to look for ways to make it safe for you to find community to talk about these issues within our organization. And then 3, we're gonna partner with or pair up with other organizations or leaders within the mental health field that if we feel we can't support you, or even if we can, we're going to bring other leaders in to help guide us or to give us, some expertise in areas that we don't have. You can get into a lot of details after that, but I think it starts with just the idea of a pastor getting up and saying, it's okay if you struggle. It's okay if you're anxious. It's okay if you're depressed. This is a safe place to be in that moment, and we'll walk you through that. I think if you do that, the other stuff will come in terms of how we execute mental health within the church and how we come alongside people.
I think that's huge, just normalizing the struggles and saying that's okay. Because how many people at some point in the trajectory of their life, there's a huge percentage of people who at some point or another are going to experience either anxiety or depression.
Yeah. And there's a quote, it's attributed to C.S. Lewis, and I can't remember which writing it in, but something to the effect, and not do it justice here, but it's 2 of the most beautiful words we can hear in the English language is me too, to know that I'm not alone, right? That other people suffer from this. And I think if you say that out loud to people, oh man, I think a lot of beautiful opportunities will open up then in terms of how you can discern to come alongside each person in their own unique way.
I know one of the things that I ran across when I was doing this podcast was I had a couple people tell me who were struggling with anxiety. It's hard for me to talk about it in the church because people see me as a spiritual leader or as a pillar of faith. And for me, when I start opening up about anxiety, they're like, no, not you. And so it almost gets this response of denial. And I think that's just a good thing to put out there for other Christians who may be in the congregation to say, when somebody is trying to tell you about their struggles, believe them and really hear them.
Yeah. And there's as you know, statistics can kind of be all over the place. I've read anywhere from, we're talking about anxiety, for example, on average, about 18% of the American population, 18 over, is diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, right? So that's someone who's diagnosed. I saw a latest stat this year that said 33%. And so it's probably pretty high right now. And, so those are people who've actually gotten help, that they're diagnosed, right? They've seen a counselor, they've seen a doctor, they've seen a psychiatrist. So if I'm a pastor and I'm preaching, let's say to a congregation, let's just make the math easy, 100 people, I could safely assume, let's say 20 to 33 people in that audience have been diagnosed with anxiety disorder. That says nothing about the other 70 people who probably have some level of anxiety or have experienced anxiety, but there's shame around it, or who haven't gotten help or don't even know they're anxious because they've lived in that feeling for so long.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge amount of the people that you're ministering to each week. And that's significant. And so that's why I think the issue has to be addressed. It's not, and that's why I think it's safe for pastors, or it's important for pastors to say from the top down, even if they haven't struggled with anxiety, that it's okay if you are.
Mm-hmm. Having been a pastor yourself, do you feel it's beneficial for pastors to receive counseling just to have an objective viewpoint or be able to talk about the stressors that come with ministry?
Yeah, I do. And I actually grew up in a pastor's home too, my entire life. And so, I credit my dad with, that was never a stigma. I knew that he had seen counselors and stuff as well. And so I think this is kind of strong language, but I would say it's a must. If you're going to be in ministry, you need to have a counselor that you work with regularly. I know when I was going through the ordination process and the Peace USA, which I'm not ordained. I decided not to do the ordination route. But my initial steps were I was required to have the MMPI assessment on me, because they want to flesh out if people are stable and stuff. And I had to see a counselor. And then when I'd already seen a counselor prior to that. And then when I decided to do my MFT training in California, for every hour you see a therapist, they'll give you 3 hours towards your state licensure, and so I did 100+ sessions with a therapist there. And then I continued that for a couple more years after I was working on my license. And I have a therapist I work with here. I probably see, right now, currently 20 to 25 different pastors within my practice. And so I feel like the pastors I see usually come from congregations where they've made that something that's important, like, as pastors, we want you to go get help, or we want you as a congregation to get help. There are people who kind of come, one off from other churches. But what I find is communities that have made it safe and told their pastors this is important, I see pastors then doing that. And so I don't know. I'm biased, but I think pastors should have a therapist they work with regularly. I think it's dangerous not to. I think counselors should have counselors that they work with regularly. I mean, I just think it's important when you're helping people that you have a place to get help and to have space to talk about things.
There's something about just clearing out your own junk that makes you more available to other people. I really believe that.
Yeah, if you're doing this work all day with people and doing pastoral counseling and doing the work that you do as a pastor or a counselor or health field, your bandwidth over time gets pretty frayed, I think, and you have less to give others. I see that, in my own marriage and my own parenting and my friendships. I just have less to give over time, and I've had to figure out ways to take care of myself and to get the help that I need so that I can be in these relationships with people. And I think pastors, there's a heavy burden on them. And so I just think they need an outlet to have that, a safe, confidential outlet to wrestle through issues.
And I think what you're kind of talking about a little bit is there's this potential for burnout. And that's not just from ministry leaders, but that's other people as well. I mean, moms can get really burnt out on what they're doing, and that can cause be the result of ongoing stress and anxiety until things just kind of crash.
Yeah, I think, burnouts can happen in any field, lay or professional field. I've noticed now, and you may have noticed in your practice, the word burnout's being used more currently, I think, with my clients and the workshops that I've been doing. I think people, as COVID has dragged on and uncertainty has dragged on, people have felt burnout. You mentioned moms, stay-at-home parents are burned out, having to teach, and to do the other things that they were doing, and parents are working from home, and burnout, I think it's not something you can usually anticipate I mean, you can sense it coming on, but from what I gather from the research and people's experience, it all of a sudden just kind of hits you, and then you can't function. And so I think we're in an interesting time right now. And I think that's why I think people reaching out to mental health people, counselors and therapists to get help is probably pretty critical.
Right. Mm-hmm. So I think we pretty much covered the stuff. You go to So at the end of every podcast, I like to ask our guests to share a story of hope, which is a time in which you received hope from God or another person.
Yeah. I knew this question was coming, and it's a really good question. I had to think about it for a while because I think, I feel fortunate that I feel like there's a lot of people around me who've given me hope or who've encouraged me. But the thing that came to mind was my daughter, who I had mentioned earlier, is 13. She's in theater at her school. And so last year when she was in a theater production, I was watching, and she had a couple different parts where she spoke, and I was watching her speak, and she did it with such confidence. Mm-hmm. And that really hit me at the core. I think also because I pictured myself at her age, and I was in a school play that you had to be in. And I remember studying my way through that and living in fear and anxiety, and seeing her be so confident, I think gave me a sense of hope that God, he changes and he redeems situations. He transforms people's lives. And so even though that I struggled with anxiety and stuttering and things were really difficult for me, he was able to help me work and to grow, that somehow maybe changed my daughter's life in such a way that she didn't have to deal with those same struggles. And so though my daughter's not me, right, I felt like in some way it was a mere God saying things are going to be okay. It just gave me a sense of hope. I saw my younger version of myself in her. And that's been something I've thought a lot about, I think, over the last probably 5 or 6 months since she had that play. And that's something I've been really encouraged by, through difficult times, that, things are going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to get through these times, and God will redeem the situations, and he'll fix the broken pieces. And so that for me is huge.
I think it's really powerful seeing your child have something maybe that you didn't have at that point in your life. It's wow, that's awesome. I'm so glad that you have that gift.
Well, and as a therapist, I've just become aware of I'm going to mess my kids up somehow. Mm-hmm. there's no perfect parenting, right?
Right.
And the things that you don't even intentionally do, kids just interpret in certain ways. And so it's given me a lot of hope to know that at the end of the day, we do the best that we can, and it's not perfect, and God's going to work. And, and it's cool to see our kids, thrive in ways that maybe we didn't thrive, or in ways that we thought we messed up. And so I think that's why I enjoy working with people and counseling, is I'm able to see people's lives change and transform. And sometimes it's really slow, and other times it's overnight. And so I think that's what keeps me engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you giving us the most valuable gift of your time today and talking about these issues with anxiety and church leaders. It's just been incredible to just get your wisdom on these issues.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me on. It's been fun. I enjoy doing this stuff.
Good.
Awesome.
I really enjoyed that interview, and I hope that you did too, and were able to get something good out of it. If you want to continue the conversation with us, please hop on over to Instagram and Facebook. You can follow along with the show there and hopefully receive some micro doses of encouragement for your day.
Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling. Our show is hosted by me, Carrie Bach, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. Opinions given by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of myself or By the Well Counseling. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.